Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Ann Weston, and I am a Senior Program Manager in the Alumni Engagement Office. On behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement and the Women's Leadership Council, I'd like to welcome you today to our Women in Leadership Speaker Series. The goal of the series is to bring attention to the many successful alumni of the University of Rhode Island and corporate leaders by highlighting their career paths, providing inspiration, and sharing their knowledge and experiences with students and alumni. I'd like to note that this program is being recorded for future viewing. Additionally, we will be taking audience questions and answers at the end of the program. If you have any questions for our speaker, you can type it into the Q&A feature that you see on your screen at any time during the program. Please note that we may not be able to get to all the questions today. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a special thank you to our president of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, Lil O'Rourke, and Vice President of Alumni Engagement, Michelle Netta. Thanks to you both for your support of this program and for joining us today. I'd also like to highlight the Women's Leadership Council. Led by a group of volunteer alumni, this council seeks to develop opportunities for all URI women by offering programs for alumni to interact and act as role models for students and one another. Additionally, the Women's Leadership Council supports and promotes the Women Transforming Women Endowed Scholarship, a scholarship that is awarded each year to a woman-identified student who holds a leadership position and maintains a GPA of at least 3.0. Within a few days of this program, we will send out the webinar recording as well as a link to this important scholarship. Now I would like to introduce our host, Mary Grace Almendrez. As an integral part of the President's Leadership Council, Dr. Almendrez advises and informs the President and Vice Presidents of issues related to social justice at URI. And as Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, she is a liaison for the President and gives voice to emergent issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion within the university, local community, and nationally as it affects the university. She oversees the Gender and Sexuality Center, Multicultural Student Services Center, and Women's Center. Dr. Almendrez comes to URI with a record of distinguished and lengthy service in higher education. Prior to URI, she was Associate Vice President for Campus Life and Dean of Students at Brown University, Assistant Dean of Multicultural Student Services at the University of San Francisco, Director of the Office in Admission and Diversity at Notre Dame de Namur University, and Director of Multicultural Services at McDaniel College. She is a board member of College Visions in Providence and previously served on the Youth in Action and HARI boards. She earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of San Diego, her master's degree in human resources development from McDaniel College, and her doctorate in education from the University of San Francisco. She holds a certificate from Harvard Graduate School of Education's Institute for Educational Management. We are so lucky to have Mary Grace's leadership at URI and also as our host today. Welcome and thank you again, Mary Grace. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and I'm so honored to be here to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Netta Jenkins is a 2008 graduate of URI's Communication Studies program. She is a leading voice in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field, whose soaring audience engagement was undoubtedly a key factor in Forbes naming her as one of the top 7 anti-racism consultants in the world. Netta was featured in CIO Views publication as the top 10 most influential Black women in business to follow in 2021. An acclaimed author with a deep background in communications, leadership, and behavioral psychology, Netta has been advising corporations and audience of all kinds for more than 15 years on the most effective strategies to address systemic racism, its traumatic impact, and the path to social justice. Netta's 75,000 plus followers on LinkedIn draw on her knowledge and insights on DEI concerns such as corporate accountability, leadership authenticity, product inclusiveness, history and policy of structural racism, and career strategy through her main feed, interactive LinkedIn Live conversations, and her monthly LinkedIn newsletter that garnered approximately 1,000 subscribers in one day alone after launch. Her website, nettajenkins.com, sees 8,000 visitors each month who read and take advantage of the guidance she provides. Through Dipper, a data technology platform Netta co-founded, professionals of color find a digital safe place where they can share experiences and find advice on their path to a better workplace, one review at a time, whether good, bad, or indifferent. I'd like to thank Netta Jenkins for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. Welcome, Netta.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so excited to speak on the topic today of bold allyship. If you are excited to learn about this topic today, please put in the chat room that you are excited, or put how you're feeling right now. Today, this session will really help us to understand how to leverage our privilege and our power to drive impactful change management. So I always like to start off with my personal experience, my personal story into the work that I do, and then we'll also talk about what it means to be a bold ally. Now, in my personal experience, I grew up in a predominantly Caucasian neighborhood where we faced extreme racism. At the age of 7, I watched a white woman spit in my mother's face, and I watched the spit drip down her cheek as this woman said, "Blacks don't belong in my neighborhood." I was 7 years old and silent. So my mom was in disbelief and fearful of what would happen if she retaliated or decided to call the cops, because she could be considered the perpetrator solely because of the color of her skin. She wouldn't be viewed as the victim. So I'll provide bold scenarios today that will really help you to identify the type of role that you'd play as an ally, right? In that particular personal experience that I shared, I didn't have an ally in that situation, right? And it actually, through the experience that I shared, is what propels me to do this work, this very impactful work every single day of my life. But today I'm going to provide you with a couple scenarios. Scenario A, you've witnessed the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impact Black and brown communities. You've seen the horrific murder of George Floyd. You've heard about the influx of Black trans murders, experiencing many emotions like sadness, helplessness, fear, and even frustration. You know that something is wrong, but you don't know what to do about it. You know that if you don't say anything or don't say something, you'll be judged or seen as unsupportive or indifferent. You learn about Blackout Tuesday and decide to post a Black square on Instagram or hashtag Black Lives Matter. At work, you witness your Black and brown employees' lack of participation and overhear conversations with coworkers who don't know how to address Black and brown people during these times. They say, "I wonder if they're okay." These are such crazy times. These protests are getting out of control. You know what? I don't know what to do. You feel the same way and you remain silent because to address these issues is too uncomfortable. Now that was scenario A. And think about it. Is that you? Have you been in that situation? Scenario B, you're riding in an Uber. And as you and your driver engage in conversation, you discover he's an older Latinx veteran. You're conversing about the struggles of balancing both work and parenthood when he suddenly is pulled over by the police. You witness the officer threaten and use derogatory terms to address him. You sit in the car for 20 minutes as the police officer interrogates your driver and continues to ask if you are safe. The officer accuses your driver of changing lanes illegally when he did not. So the officer proceeds to give your driver a ticket. You're angry and disheartened that your driver had to experience this, but worse yet, you're late for work. You choose to empathize with your driver and acknowledge that he was treated unfairly. You discuss with him that he should dispute the ticket and he's done nothing wrong. He insists that you let it go because stuff like this happens all the time. So you respect his decision and instead you zell him the amount of the ticket. You ask if there's anything you can do for the driver. He begins to vent about how this keeps happening to him and he's tired. You listen without interrupting and you both walk away from this situation a little lighter. Now, which scenario do you most identify with? Feel free to put 1 for scenario 1 and 2 for scenario 2 in the chat. Now, before we dive into bold allyship and what that is, I want to cover what it's not, right? Performative allyship, as seen in scenario A, is when someone from a non-marginalized group professes and claims to support a marginalized group in a way that either isn't helpful or that actively harms that group. It usually involves the quote unquote ally, receiving some kind of reward, social media pat on the back or emoji praying hands for being a good person or on the right side. Now, scenario B is an example of true allyship. When someone from a non-marginalized group uses their privilege to advocate for marginalized groups, they actually transfer the benefits of their privilege to those who lack it. Now, in a professional setting, for instance, focusing on your commitment to hiring people from overlooked populations is one thing, but are you committed to career growth, belonging opportunities and programs to ensure retention? So our journey continues together today. We're all learning together, right? And for today's discussion, I've simplified the word ally to an acronym. Ally stands for always listening, learning, and yielding. So when you consider an ally, words like friend, confidant, team player, and advocate may come to mind. See, we consider allies when we reflect on past experiences with childhood friends, teammates on our old sport teams, or favorite aunt who slips us $20 every visit, or even the bubbly barista at our favorite coffee shop who supports our terrible caffeine habits. But on a basic level, it's really about finding common humanity, really recognizing that no matter your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your ability, your religion, your creed, your favorite president, or even your ice cream flavor, we are actually all human beings. Further and more specifically, it's about what products, messages, or any kind of company or educational institution output could benefit from the contributions of diverse team members. However, you must understand and take heed to the importance and necessity of these contributions. Now, I always like to talk about history, right? I can't talk about bold allyship without incorporating history into this a bit. Historically, Americans are challenged at times to find humanity due to the diverse array of people who come in contact on a day-to-day basis. And it's either an arguably more natural to identify with someone from the same religion, same ethnic group, same hometown, same sports team. Like imagine moving to America, to a big city, to a big city with no real sense of belonging quite yet. What do? We naturally, as human beings, we gravitate to those who you think most understands you naturally. However, if you qualify and almost confine this sameness to be the color of one's skin, the difference in language or socioeconomic status, you negate an entire population of people who may relate to you on another and even deeper level. And if you only commune, identify, or even work with people solely based on your comfort zone, you'll find that you've consciously or unconsciously othered people, making what could have been a community referred to us now a community that is us versus them. Now, don't get me wrong, othering is at the core of American culture and society. See, the others were enslaved or incarcerated or murdered or came here to achieve the American dream, but were thawed in pursuit. See, indigenous nations were actually nearly reduced out of existence, and numerous others were and still are targeted due to religion, financial, economic, and even social status. So we understand that othering was a process of strategic plan of power, of structure, and establishing roles for who's who and who isn't. And for the most part, we can agree that this structure was flawed and it was actually subjective. However, I want us to take a good look at today's society and even ourselves. See, this part of our journey together really requires our full participation and even engagement. So if you're willing, I'd like for you to consider the answers to this question. Have you ever been called a derogatory slur based on otherness? Has someone ever overlooked you, your voice, your perspective, or opinion due to otherness? Has someone ever commented on your otherness in the form of a compliment or insult? Has someone ever referred to your otherness as exotic, different, or cool? Has your otherness been dehumanized, appropriated, or utilized poorly? Have you ever been bullied based on your race, age, gender, or sexual orientation? Have you either witnessed or inadvertently othered someone from an overlooked population? Oftentimes, we witness these things happening. And I'll even say earlier in my career, I would witness these things happening and I wouldn't say anything. I would remain silent. So in searching for the answers to these questions, what thoughts come up for you? What people came to your mind? How do you feel? It's very important as we start to ask ourselves these difficult questions, we really begin to tap into the feelings. Right? Oftentimes we think about questions like these, but we don't tap into how does this make us feel? Why is this making us feel this way? Is there some anxiousness? See, this exercise reveals that we as a society, in fact, haven't done much of a good job dismantling this concept of other, just enabling and perpetuating it. So I really want to dive into the acronym at this time, ALLY. That's always learning, listening, and yielding. The A in ally stands for always. So the textbook definition of allyship is the lifelong process of building relationships based on trust. And I'll say that word again, trust, because that's a big one. Consistency, that's a big one. Accountability, that's another big one, with marginalized individuals and or group of people. See, we can begin to dissect the many populations, the subgroups and individuals that comprise these overlooked groups. But part of allyship is taking into consideration who needs it and when. See, when a house is on fire, the firemen don't utilize their noble efforts on all the houses in the neighborhood, just the one that's rapidly smoldering in flames. We have witnessed the racial pandemic incited by the tragic murder of George Floyd, right? Compounded by the already existing disproportionate rate of Black and Brown deaths due to COVID-19, and even increased Asian hate and deaths due to political powers and rhetoric. The A, or always, in allyship compels us to consistently keep abreast of these systemic issues. See, bold allyship, I always like to say it calls us to face those hard questions and stand toe-to-toe with that person in the mirror and ask ourselves, how are my actions meaningfully influencing the experience of individuals with marginalized identities? To what extent is it adding positive experiences or mitigating negative ones? How are my actions influencing my team's sentiment toward the issue, I care about? To what extent am I building momentum, demonstrating a proof of concept, or shifting people's sense of normal? How are my actions making full use of my influence and skills? What tactics and strategies are I best equipped to utilize, and to what extent am I utilizing them? How are my actions institutionalizing the change that I want to see? And to what extent would my positive impact persist if I left? What am I leaving behind for those who will come after me? See, the answer to these questions always, and I'll repeat that, the A for an ally, always call us to action. And it always requires you. So this brings us to our second letter, L, in ally. See, the L stands for learning. How can we be called to act as an ally with no tools, understanding, or strategy on how we can act? So you want to learn about the ways in which the university truly strives for diversity efforts. For instance, working for large corporations, I've witnessed companies send their Black and Brown employees to predominantly white corporate events and participate in meetings where they were the only melanated faces, all while their counterparts have yet to be exposed to Black, Latinx, or Asian conferences. Learn about who this responsibility also falls on: recruitment, management, who does what? Why is their position vital and a key component to fostering an environment conducive to a diverse environment? Learn about policies put into place that support and advocate for people from overlooked populations in the workplace. Learn about compensation and how people of color compare to that of their counterparts. First, though, you must understand that the lack of this knowledge is actually an example of privilege. And this first thing we need to learn is privilege, power, and proper utilization. See, the textbook definition shares that privilege is this special right. It's this advantage. It's an immunity granted to or available only to a particular group or person. Writer Sam Ferguson expounds upon the definition a little more, sharing that these advantages are unearned benefits given to people who fit into a specific social group. See, in my experience, whenever people hear this word privilege, it actually instills feelings and thoughts of guilt and discomfort. People assume that this means that their good character is in jeopardy or their life challenges and personal struggles don't matter. They respond to this concept of privilege with, Netta, it's not my fault. Netta, I did not ask for this. Or Netta, I frankly just don't know what to do about it. At this moment, I want us to reflect on this very word, privilege. See, assess the ways in which you've experienced it or utilized it. And this is something that I actually do every day, right? I think about the privilege that I hold as a Black woman that is an executive at a technology firm, but also having access to education, having access to both parents in my household, having access to even the environment that I grew up in. These are privileges that I hold. But the bigger question is, Netta, how are you impacting and how are you using the privilege that you hold to impact the people around you? How do you then educate the people around you to continue to impact the people around them? See, that's what it's about. How do we pay it forward? And so if you've been able to avoid conversations and negate freely in your home, workspace, or social circles without discussing topics like ableism, racial and ethnic disparity, or LGBTQIA+ rights, and more, that's privilege. If you've been able to tune out even during this very conversation due to discomfort or lack of understanding or interest, that's actually privilege. See, the late John Lewis once said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. When you have to say something, you have to do something. Now more than ever, people are actually uniting in allyship to really dismantle flawed systems, eradicate outdated ideologies, and initiate these very difficult conversations to promote equity and inclusion. See, as a result, we're anticipating reform. We're actually witnessing the proposing and passing of laws and calling for the revision of many policies and practices. So I want you to really think about how you can discover the ways in which you can utilize your power, your voice, your ability, and your privilege. Protesting is not for everyone, right? But the beginnings of this can look like asking folks which pronouns they prefer, correcting your family members when they use the wrong term or racial slur in private, following pages on social media that keep you abreast of current issues, donating to anti-bias campaigns and initiatives that really push this agenda forward, or learning about concepts like microaggression that are small in stature but painful in effect, especially within the workplace. And to just touch on this new term for those that are just hearing it today, microaggressions are daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities or slights toward people of color. And these can look like not being considered a part of the team, assuming one speaks or prefers a certain language due to their perceived ethnic background, misconstruing honesty and assertiveness for being feisty or aggressive, kind of the stereotypical for a person of color, right? Implying that straight hair is dominant and prettier or professional. Being surprised by the notion of a person of color being articulate or well-educated. So those are some examples. But in this very moment, I want us to reflect on which and ways in which we have perpetuated or experienced even those microaggressions. See, most people in the workplace did not experience an unbiased history curriculum. Becoming well-versed in many ways in which Black, Brown, Asian communities, Latinx communities experience disproportionate rates of bias, prejudice, and systems is an essential, and it's actually an integral part of allyship. See, some of us are aware as to how to be the perfect ally, but none of us are perfect. But some of us are better at communicating that our intent is authentic and are malleable to new information. Now, which transitions us into L, learning to listen with care. See, what good is your allyship if you're not actually helping those who you claim to support? It's important to understand the need, but most importantly, to listen to how you can help to contribute to that need. Be aware that this country's narrative is shaped by and reflective of one perspective, one history, one common understanding. However, this perspective, history, and understanding are not complete, right? This narrative excuse eradicates and dismisses the presence, the efforts, and contributions of others. So listening actually implores us to activate the attentiveness, being fully present when someone shares their experiences, empathy, validating and affirming different experiences, and even silence when the moment calls for it. Now below, I just want to kind of share some examples of statements that are misconstrued as allyship. Let's celebrate your similarities rather than our differences. I had no idea how bad it is and the injustice. Or Chinese versus the actual cultural background of an individual. LGBT versus LGBTQIA+, or the proper pronouns. See, bold allies do the work to dismantle these thoughts in themselves and in others. They actually reconsider the ways in which they approach certain situations. They reflect and process the mistakes they've made, and they take accountability for them. And that is the hard part. We may not comprehend the gravity and the magnitude of certain experiences or walks of life. And you know what? Sometimes our privilege may want to assert itself in conversations in which our perspectives differ. However, a bold ally's task is to yield to that differing perspective. This brings us to our final point here and last letter, Y in ally. So when I assess the word yield, other words like submit, surrender, or give way to came to mind. I was immediately brought back to a principle I learned as a child and now teach my own children. Sharing is caring, very basic concepts. Allyship is the living representation of this sentiment. Yielding requires us to actually step outside of our comfort zone, to incorporate others' perspectives, worldviews, values, and even cultures. You see, yielding requires us to actually activate radical empathy or the curiosity about others. This is not to be misconstrued with questioning or imposing on people and the quest to learn more about them. This simply means having a conversation with the person next to you while you're on the train. I know we're in COVID times, right? So it's a little different. But even with our children, with our nieces, our nephews, with the waitress at the restaurant, colleagues virtually, engaging in fruitful dialogue really expands our horizons, creating a more welcoming, inclusive, and culturally aware atmosphere when we can learn through observation, listening, and the casual conversation. Then we can begin to understand one another and really discover the beauty in our humanity. So how can one yield in the workplace? See, for leadership, this looks like sharing your personal story around why DEI matters. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Discussing DEI-related gaps on your team, encouraging your team to hold you accountable, and you should hold your management peers accountable, creating that DEI commitment team plan. Typically what I tend to see in educational institutions and even corporations, as an organization, there is a DEI commitment. But then we forget about the individual commitment, and the individual commitment actually makes deeper impact, right? So we want to really practice champion allyship. You're in a position of power and influence, so advocate for a person from a marginalized group to highlight their work in front of stakeholders. And what I can say is one of the most impactful experiences that I've had in my personal career has been a CEO that I worked very closely with that began to advocate for me in rooms that I wasn't in. And that led to me then presenting to other executives. And at that time, I was working for an organization called IAC. IAC has over 150 different brands like Match and Vimeo and Tinder, right? And some of those dating sites. And so I had the opportunity to present to executives at the parent company level on multiple occasions because I had a very strong advocate, but he understood the privilege and power that he had within the organization. And all it took was for him to give me the space to do that. And I saw how quickly my career propelled. So we have the ability to do that, but it's very important that we are very mindful of the acronym that I created today and taking those crucial steps to create that impactful change and be bold allies. I thank you all for listening today, and I want to open it up for any questions.
Okay, this is somewhat two parts. As a leading voice in the DEI field, can you assess the progress that has been made in the corporate world since you first started? And why do you think the messages of accountability, authenticity, and inclusivity resonate so strongly today as compared to even 5 years ago?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's such a great question. When I first started this journey of DEI, and I joke around, but I'm so serious, I started when I was young, and it really was after that incident of watching that woman spit in my mother's face, and being silent and wanting to then have that voice. But in terms of corporations, and I want to kind of take it back 5 years ago, it was stale. I'll be very, very blunt and say that leaders did not understand how quickly our world was changing, how quickly there were individuals from all backgrounds and ethnicities that really value social impact. They also, and I think as human beings, we also did not know COVID was going to hit. And I do strongly believe that through COVID, and it's unfortunate that the world literally had to stop in order for us to see what was happening around us. And then we all saw the murder of George Floyd. We watched that as a society. And I saw how quickly the world began to shift. I saw how quickly we started to see more bold allies. I actually had, there were a couple corporations that I was working with, and there's two examples I'll provide. One, there was an organization that had reached out to me before the murder of George Floyd, before that year, and had said, hey, Netta, we want to do some DEI training. We want to also do some anti-racism training. We want to be bold in our approach. I was excited. That's the work that I do, right? Well, they never did it. They took their time. And then what happened? COVID hit and the murder of George Floyd happened. I remember the HR person reaching back out to me, crying in tears and saying, Netta, I'm so upset that we never did this. She said, we are actually closing. Our organization is closing down because there was a couple situations that took place, and folks from overlooked populations spoke openly about how they didn't feel included, how there was a high level of bias taking place within the organization and how it impacted them. And she said, overnight, we lost more than half of our customers. So that's what we're seeing right now. And that was hard, right? And she's just like, but I wanted to do this and I wanted to make a move on this and I didn't, Netta. And so I'm starting to see that leaders also are realizing that, whoa, we're in a different world. We're not in this silent world anymore. We're not in this world where people are complicit. I mean, I've had even leaders from other organizations that have said, white male leaders that have said, Netta, if I don't see that there's an increase in representation within leadership, I'm going to leave and go to another organization that's more diverse because I'm not going to stand for this. That's a part of bold allyship as well. And so going back to that question, that's what I see taking action. I'm seeing that communities from all backgrounds, right, and various experiences are coming together and they're wanting and they're demanding this change.
Great, thank you. So this next question actually follows that a little bit and sort of expands on it. So while corporate world is making progress, your website shows that 25% of companies have concrete targets for gender diversity, despite nearly 2/3 stating that they have strategies in place to recruit a more diverse workforce. How do you help companies move from just having a policy to actually executing on that strategy? If you could expand on that, that would be great.
Absolutely. I always try to take it in phases with organizations. I think really the first step is starting off with education. Education is really, really important, and not the education where it's just a one and done session and then, hey, we're all woke today, right? It's the type of education that's going to be sustainable and longstanding, the type of education that is going to allow for managers and their direct reports to actually have these conversations every single time they have a weekly meeting. So when I start to work with organizations in that way from an educational standpoint, I start to see the shift that takes place because people are more aware, but they're also implementing these tools. I think in terms of the accountability piece, oftentimes what I find within organizations is folks will say, oh goodness, DEI, it's another thing that I have to do. DEI is supposed to be embedded in the work that we all do already every single day. It's not supposed to be an additional thing, right? And so also reshaping and retooling folks' mindsets is critical in that respect. From an accountability perspective, I also like to focus on DEI KPIs for organizations. And so there are 3 KPIs that I've created. There's recruiting and retention, there's growth and development, and then there's branding and engagement. And branding and engagement is really like that user case for teams that have really been able to kind of foster that inclusive environment. I often find that organizations are so focused on making sure that there's increased representation, but they don't have a safe space to foster that representation. That's even more detrimental. Right? So I tell organizations, no, let's work on creating, that's the first step, creating an inclusive space where folks are open to talk about these things, open to also, and they understand the impact and the severity that especially professionals of color experience within the workplace. So a lot of the work that I do is deep diving into mindsets and reshifting and retooling that. And then we can put the accountability measures on top of that. I oftentimes also like to say that those DEI KPIs should also be aligned to compensation and to bonus plans as well. So if we're trying to work on increasing representation, and that's the recruiting and retention pillar, well, then each manager that has direct reports, that has to be built into it. It has to be built into performance evaluations as well. If that piece of it is not built in, then we don't really see the real change. People don't, it's almost like we all know that we're not supposed to speed on the road. We all take chances every now and then, but we know that if we speed, we may just get a ticket. And for some folks, it's even worse. So we go a little slower. And I think it's the same concept when we know that there is a level of consequence there in place.
Great, thank you again. So this next question is a little bit more about you and growing up. So you have vivid memories of growing up in Rhode Island and the challenges and obstacles as you faced as a child, as you mentioned earlier. How did you develop the courage and determination to overcome the racism and biases you faced?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much of overcoming per se, because it's always a part of you. Even when I tell my story now, I'd be lying if I didn't say it brings a bit of sensitivity in my heart each time that I have to say it. But really the way that I started to tackle this work is because, like I said, I was silent within those moments that I had that experience. And I was always a very vocal child. And so for a very long time, I began to question, oh, why didn't I say anything? Why didn't I do anything? And then what happened was I went off to school, and there was more that was happening in terms of like the racial tension within the community. But I had said to myself, I remember my mom saying, hey, Netta, I didn't bring you in this world to cry about things. I brought you in this world to create change. And I remember looking at her and thinking, does this African lady think that I'm Martin Luther King? Like, what's going on here? But those words, and it really goes back to the empowering and inspirational words that our family members, our friends, our parents tell us, because it was always ingrained within me. And while I was in middle school, in 8th grade, and heading to 9th grade, I said, I'm going to become president of the freshman class. And I was one of 3 Black people at that time. And I did. And I became president of the freshman class. And while I was in Johnston High School, I began to challenge the curriculum. I challenged my teachers. Now, they didn't like it all the time, right? And I remember my student council teacher saying to me, well, Netta, you know, your big gig here is to fold flowers for the freshman float. And I looked at him and I said, oh, no, I am here to create change, right? So a part of that, again, was through those empowering, inspirational words. And that is what really had propelled me to do the work that I do today. You know, I always joke around about this, but coming from an African household, you really have three occupations. You could be a doctor, an attorney, or an engineer. And so from a very young age, my parents were buying me books to learn about the law and to learn about becoming an attorney at a very, very young age. The same thing, my mom was like, well, I want you to be a cardiovascular surgeon. So she purchased books for me to learn about that, but that wasn't my path. I knew that I had the power to really utilize my voice in that way. And that's the path that I'm on today. So that's what really propels me there.
Great, great, very inspiring to hear that. Couple more questions. The next one, what strategies have you seen as successful in moving the needle when senior management of a company does not think that there's a need to address DEI?
So, so this one is always an interesting one, because as a consultant in the DEI anti-racism space, one thing I'm not a fan of is trying to shift someone's mindset that does not want to be shifted. So if there are leaders that are saying, no, I don't want this, well, then they can see how that pans out for them. I'd like to work with leaders that may say, you know what, I know that there's something here, I just don't know what to do, Netta. I want to, right? So, and there's a difference because, you know, as we start to kind of learn about human behavior, folks that are a bit more open in that sense, they'll be able to drive it and make more impact. Folks that are already closed-minded and saying, nope, I want to stay clear of this. I think we're at, in terms of our society, there's so much that has been happening, right? And as a society, we all know that we have to create this impact and change. And so if there are leaders out there in this day and age right now that are rejecting this level of work, then they're going to just have to see how it's going to pan out for their corporation or organization. And typically they do. And as I think about kind of future trends, leaders that are not really investing in DEI efforts, anti-racism efforts, it's going to be very hard for them to see the financial impact. It's going to be very hard for them to see or even retain talented professionals, because those folks are going to then say, hey, there are more remote opportunities. I don't have to be here, right? People have more options right now. And so I think it's very wise for leaders to start to think about, okay, this is something I need to dive into, especially as the world is ever changing.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for probably two more. So do you see an increase in diversity and inclusion in philanthropic circles? And why is it important to highlight more diverse philanthropic giving?
Yeah, you know, philanthropic giving it's always interesting. I'm now seeing a bit more of an increase, but I want to say within this year, really. Last year and years before, we weren't seeing that. And I also think that, and this is a larger discussion here, but with philanthropic giving, it is so close to funding and money. And oftentimes in those spaces, historically, what we've seen is that professionals of color have not been given access to that, to really push those efforts because it's so closely related. And I think now folks are seeing the gap and questioning, hey, why is there this gap? How can we begin to increase? So I think, you know, there are a lot of ideas that I have around that in terms of even from an educational standpoint, educational institutions and, you know, folks coming on campus and really understanding what the pathways are to actually get involved and be a part of that industry. Now that we're seeing that there are so many people that really value social justice and social impact and philanthropy, and understand it as well, right? And they define, and I think with philanthropy, it's defined very differently for each person, also based off of their experience and the level of impact that they've seen. I remember, you know, when I was working at IAC and attending various you know, nonprofit events and fundraising events and philanthropic events, it was always, okay, let's watch how we've been able to impact communities of color as we eat this fancy dinner, right? And as we talk about this, whereas there weren't many people that, or leaders that I saw that you could just kind of connect with, and they would then share their experiences and how it impacts them. So it's very interesting, but it's also good to see the increase happening.
Great. So we've another question that's a couple parts. So this will probably be the last one that we have time for. So diversity is often regarded as a deficit. The assumption is that the solution to the problem is assimilation. How do you condition organizations to value cultural diversity and measure the success of it? How do you deal with resistance of DEI as a valuable resource when you enter the organization as a change agent? Yeah.
Like I was saying before, oftentimes, and I'll take the last part of that, dealing with resistance, I'm an open book, and I like to be very direct with clients that I'm working with. I like to, gauge what is their level of commitment, right? What are they really looking to see? And I ask the individuals about what their goals are, what their personal experience to diversity, equity, inclusion is, what is their experience to various cultural backgrounds. Have they had experiences with other people from various cultural backgrounds? How has that impacted them, right? What has their exploration been? And I think those questions are really, really important to kind of understand, okay, well then how is this person going to be able to lead? Oftentimes what I see within organizations is even in the interview process, these types of questions aren't being asked. So even if you're a white male leader, let's say, right, that question should be asked, right? How do you lead? How did you think about leading diverse teams before? What was your experience with diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in your last organization, right? How does this impact you? What's your connection with it? Oftentimes those questions aren't asked, and what we find is that individuals join companies that don't value this work at all. And we see that they don't value it because there's such a high level of resistance. So I always then place that back on the company. But I think, again, in terms of resistance, is really just kind of asking those specific questions and getting folks to really engage and understand how they've played a role or not due to their silence or utilizing their voice and their power frankly in the wrong way, and also equipping those people with the tools to lead the right way. I've also had leaders that wanted to open up about the guilt that they had in not saying anything or saying the wrong thing. I had a lot of leaders that have opened up to me in that way. And that was almost the opening for them to do the work that they needed to do. She's like, Netta, I can't get past this guilt because I actually said this. And I know that this impacted someone. What do I do? So a part of the work that I do, and I always joke around with this too, is like therapy. It's also understanding that human behavior as well.
Great. Well, thank you again. I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions, but I really want to thank you, Netta, for your time and for this incredible conversation. I really enjoyed learning about you and hearing about your impressive and your important work. Also, a special thanks to Mary Grace for serving as our host today. We're fortunate to have both you and Mary Grace as part of the URI community. And to those of you that joined us today for the webinar, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And I'd also like to mention that we have 2 more Women in Leadership speaker series coming up. So save the date for Tuesday, January 25th with Kristen Heenan. She's Senior Partner and Chief Communications Officer at Flagship Pioneering and also a URI trustee. And on Wednesday, March 30th, we have Navin Salem, who is the founder of Edesia Nutrition. And as I mentioned, this program has been recorded and will be sent out to all of our attendees and made available for those who are unable to attend today. In the coming days, you will receive a brief survey about this program and an email message from me with a recording and a link to the Women Transforming Women Endowed Scholarship. Please complete the survey and share your thoughts on today's program so that we can bring you more engaging conversations like today as part of the Women in Leadership Speaker Series. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day. And thank you so much, Netta, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.